God's grace. God's grace is offered to all. That is to however, it is not received by all. James explains in 4:6-10, but he gave a greater grace. Therefore he said, God is opposed to the proud, but gives grace to the humble. Submit therefore to God, resist the devil, and he will flee from you. Draw near to God, and he will draw near to you. Cleanse your hands, your sinners, and purify your heart, you double-minded. Be miserable and mourn and weep. Let your laughter be turned into mourning, and your joy to gloom. Humble yourself before the Lord, and he will exalt you. God's grace is one of the most wonderful and sweetest sound we will ever hear. For it is by God's grace we are saved, and God has always shown grace to us. But what does grace mean? The definition of grace is the free and unmerited favor of God, as magnificent in the salvations of sinners and the bestowal of blessings. Now, while I was looking this up and learning about God's grace yesterday, I recently learned a simple acronym for grace that I didn't know. G is for God. R is for riches. A is for add. C is for Christ. And E is for expenses. So all in all, grace stands for God's riches at Christ's expenses. And I never really thought about it like that. It's God's riches. He gives us his riches ever. And it was at Christ's expense. Grace. But God has always shown grace even before and loved us. Even in the book of Genesis, we can see God's grace and love for mankind. Because when Adam and Eve took of the forbidden fruit of good and evil, he could have easily said, I'm done with it. He could have ended both of them. But he didn't. He showed grace and love. He punished them, but he still allowed them to live and to go forward. And people don't always think about that. That was grace then. That was love then. Because he made them once, he could easily end it and make them again. Start over. He could be like, well, this was a mistake. But he didn't. He showed compassion. He showed grace. And we need to thank God for that, because we wouldn't be here today if he hadn't. Now, yes, he punished them. That's what we can understand. Sometimes God does have to punish. It's like with a child. Sometimes you have to punish. You don't always want to, but sometimes you have to. He then showed even more grace. Again, still in Genesis, with Cain. We all know the story. Cain killed his brother Abel. God could have ended Cain. You committed murder, it's over. But no, he punished him again. Again, he punished him. But then he sent him forth. And it goes to tell Cain even had a wife and had a family after that. But again, God could have ended it back then. He even put his protection on Cain to make sure that no one else killed Cain. Because Cain was worried about that. Cain was like, whoa, you send me on out. Someone's going to kill me. God's going, no. I will put my protection on you. If anybody does, they will be punished for punishment sevenfold. Now, is that not grace? Cain committed this terrible sin, but God still did not want harm to come to Cain. He wanted Cain to learn his lesson. He wanted Cain to come back. I'm pretty sure God was going, I want Cain to ask for forgiveness and to learn his lesson, and for his family to learn his lesson. So that grace, Cain was allowed not only to live, but to marry. And then God again shows his grace with Noah. God had actually got to the point he was, I'm done, I'm wrapping out mankind. But then he looks down and he sees one righteous man, Noah. And he showed grace. He said, okay, well maybe not. I will spare this family. He allowed Noah to take his family into the ark, to spare the human race. And this was already at the point where God was getting kind of fed up with humans because we had become so sinful, so bad, that God was like, you know, I'm tired. But grace saved us again. We know His love and passion. God's grace is continuing to be mentioned many times in the Bible. But one of the most important times is that it is by the grace that we are saved now. And the most important time, the most recent, was the grace that saved us. He sent His Son to die for us through His love and grace. Because Jesus was the biggest show of God's grace and truth. Like it says in John 1:16-17. Out of the fullness we have received grace in place of grace already given. For the law was given through Moses. Grace and truth came through Jesus Christ. The law was a show of grace from the Lord. He gave Moses' people a way to sin over. He gave them the law. But knowing that mankind could never follow the law because of sin, He had a backup plan. He had Jesus Christ, which was another grace He was bestowing. So that's twice He gave grace. Once in Moses, and when He knew that would fail, He gave it again through Jesus Christ so that we would be saved. Because He knew that due to sin, people could not follow the law. People could try, but sin was always going to sink in. People was always going to give in to sin until He sent Jesus Christ. He was the final sacrifice for us. He didn't have to do it. He didn't have to do anything God has done. He didn't have to sacrifice His Son. He could have ended it day one. He could have ended it there in Canaan. He could have ended it with Noah. Just many times God could have just been like, I don't have to worry about this no more. He could end it today, but He doesn't because He loves us. He shows us His grace. That's how powerful God's grace is. He gave us an option to come back to Him, a way to come back to Him. I'm human and realistic. I'm not that strong. I don't have the grace God has. I try. But if I knew I was going to have all that headache, could you knowingly go through all of it? Just so that people could come to know you? That there was zero chance people would know you? I don't know if I could. We've got to remember, we are saved not by what we do. No matter how much work we do, we are not saved by that. We could somehow be almost perfect and constantly do it. But if we don't know Jesus and God's grace, we're not saved. But no one's actually perfect, but we could think we are, but we're not. Like it says in Ephesians 2:8-9, for it is by grace you have been saved through faith. And this is not from yourself, it's the gift of God. Not by works, so that no one can boast. Salvation is by God's grace and by His gift. It's as simple as that. There's not much more to God's grace. It's by His grace that we are saved. It's by His grace that we even exist. If you think about it. It's by His grace. And we need to glorify and praise that on a daily basis. We need to remember that every time. It's by His grace. We will overcome everything by His grace. He is with us every step because of His grace. God offers His grace to all, but only gives grace to the humble. Anybody can receive God's grace. Anybody. The worst person you think of can receive God's grace if they were humble and ask for it. He only gives it to those who ask. It's another thing to remember. We didn't get saved because He just handed it to us. We got saved because we asked Him, and He saved us. He gave us the option, but we had to accept it. We could have easily turned our backs at that moment and walked down, or wherever you were saved. You were saved at the altar or in your bedroom. You could have just kept laying there instead of rolling over, praising the Lord. Jesus emphasized the importance of humility, though, in the opening statement of His Sermon on the Mount. Blessed are the poor in spirit, for It's the kingdom of heaven. So to have grace, we have to be humble. We've got to remember that. It goes hand in hand. A proud person does not receive God's grace. They're too proud. They think they can do it themselves. They're proud. Well, I'm that good. We're nowhere near as good as God. And we need to always remember that. God is always the best and the first option. Because we are not saved by our work, but by His grace. I'm repeating myself. But it's important to remember, we are not saved by our works. We are not saved by anything we can do, we can be proud of. There's nothing to be proud of that we've done. For all of it falls short of God. Now we can do some good things, but they're not as good as God. No matter how hard we try. Now you tell some of the mega church preachers that, and they think you're lying. I know a few. You tell them that their works are not as good as God, and they look at you like crazy. That's between them and God. I know personally, I wouldn't be here without God's grace. God's had to help me out in more situations than I can count my hand on. I don't know about y'all. God's love and grace is the only thing that's allowed me to survive some of the things I've survived. We just need to give Him glory for that. And one of my favorite ways to do it, I know it's a little short, but I have a short time to make this sermon, is to sing Amazing Grace. Everybody knows that song. Beautiful song. I was looking at it, trying to decide which verses we was going to sing today. And I think 1 through 4 and then the last verse. You okay with that too? Let's sing some Amazing Grace. I'll get you the page number and sing that.